Hello and welcome to the Aperture PhotoBook Club. We are so happy you're joining us tonight, exceptionally on a Sunday evening. I am so grateful to be joined by Sarah Greenough, who is here in the midst of installing this Robert Adams exhibition at the National Gallery of Art, and also by phone with Robert Adams himself. Can you hear us, Bob?
Oh, yes, I can. It's nice to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So, Bob, do you want to tell everyone where are you right now, since you're not physically in my living room, so they can understand why?
Sure. I'm sitting in the second floor, little room overlooking the Columbia River and a small town of about 10,000 people. And it's about 3.5 miles across the river. Our view is toward the northwest, upriver toward Portland. There are about 3 freighters out there, fog coming in and going out periodically. It's a very peaceful and basically very rural setting.
It sounds wonderful. We're calling you from New York, from my living room in Manhattan. I just want to say thank you to all my Aperture colleagues, and thank you to everyone from Candle Productions for making this happen. Thank you to Ingram, who has sponsored our Aperture PhotoBook Club. A few technical details, though, before we get going. One, the chat is on, so you may not be where we are or where Bob is, but we'd love to know where you're listening, so let us know that. The Q&A function is on, so we encourage you to ask questions at any point tonight. We would love to have them. We can relay them to Bob, and I'm sure we will all be enchanted by the answers. Also, there's the closed captioning is available, but you have to turn it on yourself. So if you would like closed captioning, turn that on. And that is about it. So without further ado, we're here tonight to talk about this beautiful book, American Silence. And Bob, maybe I'll start with a question for you and say, you have made so many. Oh, wait, I should explain one thing. For those of you who are watching, for whom this makes no sense at all, Bob, we're talking to Bob through this little phone that's resting on a dictionary. So if it looks weird that we're leaning in to talk to something that doesn't look like a human being at all, that's what we're doing.
I think we're on the road to new kind of comedy, but
we may get there. But in all seriousness, you have made so many wonderful books in your life, Bob. I'm wondering if you'd tell us a little bit about what makes this one special.
It's a question that's hard for me to address. Maybe it's not even right for me to address. It's for other people to judge.
Well,
but
we can ask Sarah to answer it too. So yes.
I think for me, this book is special first because it contains commentary by 2 writers that I very much respect, and with whom I share very fundamental values. One is Sarah Greenough, and the other is Terry Tempest Williams. The book also does contain some fairly recent photographs, which is gratifying. But I think the thing that makes this book most interesting to me is something that we could not have known about 10 years ago when we began planning it, which was the situation that we find ourselves, everybody finds themselves in right now. The book certainly doesn't come up with answers to some of the pain that we're experiencing, but it does curiously land square in the middle of some difficult circumstances, which the book does speak of. So I think those are the primary things that make me glad we've done this book and the show both.
I agree, but maybe let's hear what Sarah has to say too.
Well, I agree with Bob. It's I think it's interesting to think a little bit about sort of the history of this book. It started more or less in 2012 when the National Gallery was really fortunate to have a big acquisition of Bob's photographs. And soon after that, we began talking about an exhibition. Of course, there had been a big show that the Yale University Art Gallery had organized in 2010 and 2011. I knew that I wanted to do an exhibition that looked at Bob's work as a whole, but wasn't really a retrospective because Yale had done that. So I kept trying to think of a theme that we could explore in this book. And as I was reading about Bob's work, things that other people had said, I was struck by the number of people who spoke about the quality of silence that Bob captures in his work. And I realized that it was not just the silence that the beauty of nature can instill in us, but also our moral silence to its desecration. And so I proposed that idea to Bob. Amazingly, the day after I proposed the idea, I was visiting him in Astoria, and he presented me with more or less the statement that prefaces our book about the idea of silence. And it's a beautiful statement. It's one that should definitely be read. I think at that same time, I came up with the idea of calling the book, the exhibition, American Silence. And I think, Bob, you in particular were a bit concerned about that title at first. I had some hesitancy. I think you had more, wondering if it was too harsh, perhaps. And yet, as time has passed, it's only seemed to become, I think, even more relevant, even more pertinent to our own time now.
I agree, Sarah, with everything you've said.
You know what, Bob? You know what I would love, if you wouldn't mind? Could I ask? You have the book near you, right?
Yeah.
Would you mind reading your forward statement to it? Because I think it's just such a. I mean, I love hearing your voice, and I would love to hear what you wrote in your voice, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. What I wrote overnight after Sarah and I sort of jointly came up with this title, and I think both of us felt we had moved forward in finding it. What I jotted down that night was roughly the following: there are at least two kinds of silence that define us. One is the eloquent silence of the world as we were given it, the silence of light and beauty, the silence that holds a promise. It is a stillness especially audible on the prairie or next to trees, but it can be heard in many parts throughout the country. Theodore Rutgers spoke of this quiet when he wrote that hope has its hush. It asks us to care. There is also sometimes a dark silence within us, one that results from willful blindness and deafness. We struggle against it. What will America be? Will it accord with the stillness of sunlight?
Yes.
That opens up all kinds of things, of course.
Right. Since you can't see us nodding, we're making noises, but we'd rather be silent after that. I was also wondering if you are somewhat famously not on the internet, and I was wondering if you would just, for instance, that's why we're calling in, not Zooming in. Maybe you'd talk a little bit about the process of working with Sarah, or you both can talk about it, and how maybe how that process for somebody who's paying attention as they're reading the book, how does that process reflected in the selection or sequence of the plate or anything else about the book?
Boy, I'd be interested to hear what Sarah has to say about that.
We can ask her to go first if you want.
Well, all that comes to mind really is that it was a complicated, lengthy process involving numerous visits and also numerous different iterations of what was to become the book. And it was a struggle, frankly. Sarah's point that it wasn't a retrospective it's interesting. She and I really have never quite spoken of it on those in that way, but it's the truth. So the selection of pictures and the ordering of the pictures really related to the topic. They are organized chronologically, and they do go back to the beginning of pretty much the beginning of serious photography for me, but it's really hard to point to a place. I mean, the goal was to make it so that no one would ask why we ordered things or included things.
Sorry.
Make it look easy is the goal of anybody in the arts, and that's what we were trying to do. So I'm not sure that I could anyway find a place that would illustrate the complexity of the choices and the ordering. What do you think, Sarah?
I agree with you, Bob. I mean, there was just a lot of back and forth. As I say, I think we started seriously working on the exhibition at least by 2014, if not even before that. So it was something that was, just a long time coming together. I made a lot of visits out to Astoria, Oregon. We worked trying to figure out, even just basically, once we got the concept that we wanted to explore, how did we do that? And I know we don't have her on the telephone, but Bob's wife, Kirsten, had a lot to do with this as well. And all of us would look through photographs, we'd work with various sequences, show them to each other. Sometimes things worked and sometimes they didn't. It was a lot of back and forth.
The goal, which I think we had, was somehow to, as I think I may have said before, to tell the truth about some pretty grim situations, but to get beyond the despair that might lead to. And my experience has been that occasionally, I guess rarely, that balance of yes and no can be achieved in a single picture by providence, more or less. Sometimes that happens in a single picture by what you allow in and don't allow in. For example, the picture on the cover of the book, which is of Pikes Peak at dusk, 14,000-foot peak from which the America the Beautiful was written. And it looms over Colorado Springs magnificently year-round, and everybody who lives there knows it like they know their heartbeat practically. But also in that picture, there's a gas station, and so you have both the best and the worst at the same time. The thing that often makes it possible to rescue terrible subject matter in the Southwest is light. And that really was crucial to many of the pictures that I made in Colorado, where things were going from bad to worse. But for example, the picture of the woman in the window. I'm sorry, I don't have the page number, but
Hold
the
on,
woman
I'll find it.
It's the frontispiece.
Oh, there you go.
yeah,
I'll find it easily.
good, good. Well, see, in a way, it's of course a suggestion of the loneliness that we all experience, but showering down over that scene is high altitude sunlight. Even in California, where the light is degraded by air pollution severely, it's amazing how beautiful that light could be in its revelation of nature's shapes. So you're trying to locate the pictures that support American silence. And of course, sometimes the picture is just unmitigated disaster of an unmitigated disaster. For example, there's a picture in here of rubbish that people have left while they've been eating fast food in front of a fast food place. And the only way you can rescue that is by choosing pictures to accompany it that give another take on what the scene is.
And Bob, could I interrupt you for 1 second? Because there's a question that's come in, and just as I'm holding up the picture of the frontispiece, there was a question about how do you compose these photographs? And I feel as if the frontispiece of the woman in the window is, or the cover, or actually all of your pictures. You can speak about whichever one you want. But there is a question, do they just feel right to you? You know, how do you, what is it in your training or in what you do that helps you compose your pictures?
I'm always reluctant to claim anything special, but the truth is, like almost any activity, I think you have to be given some aptitude, and composition is, I think, one of those things that's made easier by what you're born with. And for example, the picture of the woman in the window, that was taken very quickly, partially because while you're walking suburbs, and I would be the same way, but if I looked out and saw somebody taking a picture of my house, I would be right out there asking them what they were planning to do. So the pictures in suburban situations are all made with just stopping as little as possible. It was taken with a Hasselblad, and of course, I can't remember if I took another shot here, but in any event, it is something that you kind of have to just instinctively go for, and then maybe you've got 10 exposures to choose from ultimately on the contact sheet. So all the ones where you missed, of course, you can mercifully 86, but the composition is absolutely important. Form is the way pictures work, and ultimately form is linked to meaning. So it has to be right. But having said that, I think one of my heroes, Brock, the painter, said the one thing that is most important in picture making is what can't be explained. And I couldn't tell you how I formed that. I just know that it had to happen that way.
Well, we're the beneficiaries of it, so thank you.
Thank you.
So I maybe we'll move on to talk about your book, Why People Photograph, which I'm proud to be associated with Aperture, one of the many Aperture books that you published. But in your foreword, you described that the subject of the book, Why People Photograph, as, and I'm quoting you, the effort we all make, photographers and non-photographers, to affirm life without lying about it, and then to behave in accord with our vision. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how this book is an expression of that, how you affirm life without lying about it, and then try to behave in accord with that vision.
It's that second part that you'd have to be a fool to answer, but
Okay. You can pick which one you want.
Okay. The affirmation, I think, is trying to. As you know, my background is in literature.
Well, maybe not everybody knows. I do know that, but you want to tell a little bit? I think that is interesting.
It's actually a background for an astonishing number of photographers. We can talk about how that might or might not be explicable, but the goal of let me start again. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of talk in literary circles about how the greatest literature had a tragic vision. And one of the commentators, and I forget what his name was, but he said the greatest writers like Shakespeare or Sophocles, they had double vision. And I think what they were trying to say was that the writers concentrated on life as it was, as tough as it was, as hard and painful as it was, but they also managed somehow to come out talking about something beyond that. I think there's a French poet, Paul Eluard, I think, but my French is terrible, but he said something about there is another world and it is this world. If you think about Hamlet, Hamlet was given an assignment to clean up Denmark. He had to kill Claudius, and he did ultimately, and yet what a mess he made of it in the process. And so you've got basically a world that is filled with evil and good, hope and despair, and that's what I think I'm trying to get at. That's what a lot of photographers are trying to get at, and writers. Trying to be honest about, particularly now, about, environmental issues, for example, and yet somehow come out the other side other than a nihilist. And I think that's the goal. Whether it happens is not for me to say. I think it happens better in some books than others, better in some pictures than others. But that is the obligation of art. That's why I'm so disappointed in much of what passes as contemporary art, because I don't even think they pose the challenge, much less reach any kind of a stab at an answer.
Well, yeah. We'll leave that aside, but I will. I have one more question about why people photograph that book, because I love there are several sections of that book that are grouped under the heading "What Can Help," which I found to be. I'm not a photographer, but it seemed like a very generous, constructive foundation about if you decide you want to make pictures, what can help. And in one of these about writing, you wrote, and I'm going to quote you again, I hope you forgive me, photographers seemed so strikingly unable to write at length about what they had made, in fact, that I came to wonder if there was any exception at all, a single case where an artist's writing did not end up making a picture smaller, less complex, less resonant, less worthy of comparison with life. And I was just wondering if you'd share with us a little bit of thinking about that, and then I'm going to ask Sarah the same question about writing about art, because I find this book, well, Tell us a little bit about your thinking about words and pictures.
It depends on what the words are about. I mean, there are great critical interpretive works. For example, I think Sarah has a gift for that. But I find that I rack my brain to think of where I've come to respond to a picture more because of what the photographer or painter or sculptor said about their own work. What they're likely to say is what used to be called in literary studies, it's likely to involve you in the intentional fallacy. In other words, you're describing what you wanted to do rather than what you did. And so, you raised this in a discussion we had by mail, Sarah, about Dorothea Lange, whom we both respect second to none, as far as I'm concerned.
And one of Aperture's founders, I might add. But yes, agreed.
Yeah. And you said that she had remarked that all pictures can be strengthened by words. And you said you didn't yourself believe that, and I agree with you. It's funny because I think I had, it's been a long time since I read things that Lang wrote, but she was, I always somehow took that to mean that the words were by the subjects or some person looking on. And as you know, Lang had a very keen ear for what her subjects sometimes said. There's a picture she has of a little Irish girl, for example, that she showed the picture apparently to an Irish poet, and the poet said something like, "There hasn't been anything like that since the flight of the wild geese." And, what a wonderful sort of eye-opening thing. But in general, I can't think really of virtually anything that any visual artist wrote about their own work that actually makes me see it more vividly or sympathetically. What do you think?
I agree. Let's hear Sarah Greenough speak a little bit about her thought.
I think, Bob, this is not just flattery, but I think many would agree with me that your writing, there are very few people who write as eloquently, as articulately as you do, not in explaining your photographs, but in helping us to understand what it is that photography and art more generally can do, what it can give to us. And so for me, in that way, your words are profoundly important, I think, to my understanding, my insights into your work. Not that you're explaining their meaning, but they're helping me to understand the mindset behind the person that took these pictures.
Thank you, Sarah. That's, now I'll admit to you something that you already know, I'm sure, and that is that's the strategy that I've used to get around this thing. Talk about other people's work when you really mean your own work. So it's a kind of cheating, but anyway, you're right.
It's not cheating. And so on one more question on the subject of words, there was a question from the audience about, do you keep a journal, Bob? And in any way, if you do, has this informed your work or your approach?
Not systematically at all, Sarah. I jot down things occasionally when I think they might be useful sometime later on, but I much more frequently jot down strong, informative, clarifying statements by others than I do my own writing. But when I go to work, then as a writer, then it's hard work. It's a lot harder than photography, frankly.
Well, for some of us, but I agree, writing is hard. I don't think I could do the photography part of it either.
But Bob, you and I suspect Sherston as well have saved a lot of your writings over time. Your first drafts, for example, of manuscripts, or I remember in looking through some of your papers, just being so wonderfully surprised to find notes from your a conversation that you had with John Sarkowski when he offered you a job at the Museum of Modern Art as a curator, I think probably after Peter Burnell had left and he was looking for a replacement. And
oh no, it was. I should just clarify that it was a job as an assistant curator, so it was nothing like replacing Peter, but.
That's your modesty, though. But I mean, your writings that you saved, your archive, is, I think, a really extraordinary thing. It was so helpful to me as I was writing the essay. It gave me such insights into the development of your work and your ideas. I just felt so honored to be able to read it.
Well, Sarah Meister can, I'm sure, second this. But when you talked to John Sarkowski, you wanted to remember it. I'll tell you.
That is for sure. That is for sure. So one of the purposes, even though we have you tuning in by phone, of the Photo Book Club is to help our members become more attuned to the very sort of materiality of the book, how the characteristics of it, what all of the choices that you and that Sarah and the designers make. So maybe if we could turn a little bit to the book and talk about it as an object, talk about maybe the paper that it's printed on. From your perspective, Bob, and then I'll ask Sarah the same thing, what's the most important thing to notice or that you want to go unnoticed, but that maybe you particularly enjoy?
That's a big question, Sarah.
I didn't say I was going to make it easy for you.
Yeah, right. There are just a host of things that will influence the way a viewer responds to the picture. For example, what kind of paper are you going to use? Are you going to use coated or uncoated paper? And what that means is the ink, when it hits the page, is either going to soak in or it's going to sit toward the top. And if you use uncoated paper, the results can be very beautiful, but they're less predictable. It's one of those things that keeps you up nights and is worse for the people that are trying to help you. Will the paper be cold white or some sort of warm, possibly tending towards sepia? And last, but by far from least, will the paper be available? Because you've used the book, the last book you did. My experience has been in the last few years, you will rarely find the same paper when you go to do the next book. It's that strange. So those questions are there. The whole question of printing, is it going to be duotone, tritone, quadratone? In other words, how many times will the plate hit the paper? Is it going to be, or the plate's going to be varnished or not? And will the varnish
but Bob, we have to, I'm going to stop you from asking more questions because part of it is, how did you decide? You made a decision.
Well, it's it's torment, I can tell you, because especially in this book. I'd be interested to hear Sarah talk on this because.
Should I let Sarah answer those questions?
Yeah. Well, just to finish
Yes.
the idea.
Sorry.
The early pictures were all printed on a paper manufactured in Germany. Very rich, stark black and white called Bravira. Then later on, I began to print on a very, very different paper called Portriga. And so the prints that you'll see on the wall in Washington vary a lot in their warmth, in their tonalities, and yet in a book, you have to choose one method and stick with it. So why don't you talk about this? How difficult it is to stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, another really critical point to raise is who is making the separations for you? How is that being done? We were exceedingly fortunate with this book that Thomas Palmer made the separations.
But maybe you even explain, what do you mean separations? You know what?
The steps that you have to go through from having a photograph in front of you to having a plate which can then be inked and run through a press 2 or 3 times to make the reproduction. You need to have a master like Thomas Palmer, someone who understands Bob's photographs and is able to work with them and to create these just extraordinary reproductions that we have in the book. So it's an exceedingly complex process.
Would you maybe, Sarah, Bob raised a lot of questions about coded, uncoded, warm, cool. Maybe while we're looking at some of these pictures, will you tell us what decisions you ended up making?
Well, we made a number of proofs on different papers. The book was printed at Meridian outside of Providence in Rhode Island. We selected a number of papers, some coded, some uncoded, with different tonalities, some slightly warmer, some cooler, and we would print the same group of images on each of the proofs and then compare them. And we ended up choosing the uncoded paper primarily because we felt that the coded papers, and as Bob said, this is all dependent on what you can get a hold of. We printed this book during the pandemic, which of course, made it all the harder. But we felt that the coded papers, to use Bob's word, he felt that they started to look plastic. That the images lost a sense of life and vitality to them. So we ended up printing it on this beautiful, I think, uncoded paper.
I love it too. I think also you don't realize that in some of these pictures, especially with dark, I'm trying to get to a page, some of these sort of darker summer nights pictures, the way that the ink sort of soaks into the uncoded paper so that you can look at it even on an angle and it doesn't have a sort of sheen or a glare. It really makes for a very special sensory experience.
It does. It has a kind of depth, Sarah, that just matches the subject. In this case, I think, the night.
Yep. So do you want to tell us a little, either one of you can answer this question, I'll let you choose, about the selection and the sequencing? I've sort of been going through some pages giving people not really an idea of how this happens, but maybe Sarah, since you can see what I'm looking at, how was the process of deciding, we know your intent wasn't to make it a retrospective, and yet the book has a very clear structure that I would say chronology barely begins to describe it, if I were as an outsider, I would say. Is there a spread that you'd like to discuss or something that Am I on a good one?
I mean, for the sequence, again, it was just a lot of back and forth of working with Bob, and as I said, also with Sherston, and just laying the pictures out on top of a flat file, trying to understand what worked, what followed, one after another. Sarah has the book open, Bob, right now to pictures from the New West in Denver. We're looking right now
These are
at
plates 96 and 97 if you're following along at home.
we're looking now at the interior, of what looks like a big box store, and then actually one of my favorite pictures, which is of a young girl sitting outside in front of a store with her head looking down, looking sort of lost. And
That's the one you told me, Sarah. My gosh, that could have been me.
it does look. I identify with that picture so much. I have to say it sort of expresses the sense that I had as a child growing up of just not understanding this world around me. And so, Sarah, I can't answer you for how it happened, except to just say that we just kept looking at these pictures over and over again, trying to figure out a sequence that seemed to flow from one picture to another. And when it didn't,
Sarah, we also we haven't mentioned, we also subdivided the topic down into 3 sections, and that did influence how we had a section called The Gift, which meant the natural world as we were given it, and then our response, and then a third section called Tendency, which the definition, gosh, I thought I'd never forget this, but its definition of tendency is basically let me see here. Tendency, this is from the Webster's Third Dictionary, the temporary possession of what belongs to another. So that division, of course, had a lot to do with how the book is organized.
Exactly. Yeah. We should have mentioned that. So the first section, The Gift, includes pictures of the natural world, some inhabited, or some with people, some with animals as well. It includes pictures from throughout Bob's career, sort of late 60s to the 2000s. And really shows Bob's extraordinary ability to capture that sense of awe that nature can inspire in us. And then our response shows how we as a society, as a culture, have responded to the natural world, what we have done to it. And it starts with pictures that Bob took in the late 60s in Colorado of Hispanic villages and white immigrant settlements on the Eastern Plains, and then goes into the pictures that he took in the late 60s and early 70s of the natural landscape, those that became from the Missouri West, and then to the pictures around Denver and Colorado Springs. And it progresses through Bob's work sort of chronologically from there. Sarah has the book open now to the pictures from our lives and our children, which are images that Bob made in response to a nuclear power, a plant that was 10 miles upwind from Denver that manufactured materials that were used in nuclear weapons. And there was great concern at the time about what would happen if a fire occurred at the plant, and Denver and anything downwind would have been subject to a great catastrophe. And Bob made this very beautiful, moving series of pictures showing what we would lose should such a catastrophic event like that happen. And it would quite simply be our lives and our children. And from there, we then move into pictures that Bob took in Southern California that show the landscape, particularly around Los Angeles, where he had gone to college and graduate school in the 50s and 60s, and showed the extraordinary transformation that occurred in the Los Angeles region by the time he went back in the late 70s and early 80s. And then from there, we go to the pictures of clear cutting that he made in Oregon in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then that ends our response section. And then from there, we go into this final series of pictures we have in the exhibition called Tenancy. Bob, do you want to describe Tenancy?
It's all set in a peninsula about 40 miles south of here, and on the peninsula, it's called a spit, runs parallel to the beach, or to the river comes in and runs parallel to the ocean. Pardon me, for 2.5 miles, creating this spit, and on the river side of the spit, you have the remains of clear cutting. The big old stumps have washed down from the original first growth forest. And the interior of the spit is a peaceful, grassy place. And then, of course, on the ocean side, you have the beauty of the sea. The strange thing, of course, as a photographer, is the growing realization of how little you can really show. And you're talking to a really frustrated, frightened person at this point. On the prairie, for example, since I took those pictures, the place has been pretty much covered with fracking wells. And what's coming out about fracking is that they pump chemicals down into the ground to make the gas and oil come out, but the poisonous chemicals that they pump into the ground can never be extracted. So you can never drill a well there for water for people or for animals. Here you walk the beach, and it looks beautiful, but the sand is absolutely mixed with microplastics, tiny dust-sized particles of plastic that are pretty much there and going to be there forever. And if you looked beneath the surface of the breakers and on out for a mile or two, what you would see on the bottom of the ocean is a desert. There is nothing. There are no kelp forests. There's nothing living. You might see an odd tennis shoe or scrap of junk every once in a while. But all of that to say that the more I work, the more Woody Allen, what did he say? Something about you try to be cynical, but you can't keep up, and that's a little bit the way I feel. The world is changing so fast, and people are watching so little that I don't know where it's going, but I've got a pretty good idea.
So, Bob, there are two questions that have come in. One was asking about plate 120, which is one of the ones from Our Lives and Our Children. And the question is, there was another question that came in earlier that I ignored about whether you develop your own film then or still, but maybe it's a little bit more of a process-oriented question. So I want to try to address that. The question is...
I used to, until about 5 years ago, I developed all my own film, and I had to, because what I was after were some qualities of light that I couldn't get from commercial development. So it took me 2 or 3 years to find out how to develop film to the standards that I had to have. So what about?
So the question about the plate from Our Lives and Our Children, it's the one of the woman in the sort of shorts holding a baby, and it's slightly out of focus. And the question was, talk to us about that decision, because obviously there's a precision in some of your work that is quite different from this.
The pictures of people in the book and project that I did relative to the Rocky Flats nuclear plant. It was strange. I knew I wanted to take pictures of people so that they looked like they were important and supremely worth protecting. So I set out I did not want people to know that I was taking the pictures. I wanted them to look natural. But I shot hundreds of pictures, and I came back and developed and went to the contact sheets, and I was dumbfounded by how tired and discouraged and grim people looked. So the struggle became to get pictures of people that were concerned and caring. And I did it finally by taking pictures without looking through the finder. I had a Hasselblad super wide camera, and I carried it underneath my arm, right next to a bag of groceries. And if I saw somebody coming who looked like they might be useful, I would at the last minute shift the bag of groceries, and under that bag I had my other hand, and I took the picture. And then the only time in my life I cropped pictures like crazy, because of course I hadn't any idea of what the edge of the frame would be the way they were taken. But what I really wanted were pictures of people trying, of people that deserve some help. And so that was the rule. It was a slow process. It was very uncomfortable. I'm sure that if I had taken pictures, if I had known everybody that I took pictures of, there are cases I'm sure I would not have done it. Because people obviously deserve some privacy, and some of them are fighting battles I had no notion of. But I just had to do it. That's about all I can say.
That's a good reason for those pictures not to be in focus, I think, also. So thank you.
That's true.
I think we're getting toward the end of the hour, but Sarah, the other Sarah, had a really wonderful question for you, and I thought maybe we'd give her the honor of asking you her last question, if that's okay.
My question, Bob, was the one that I wrote to you about earlier this past week, and Sarah went back and looked at why photographs. I went and I looked at your more recent book, Art Can Help, and I was struck by the quote that you have in the beginning of it by Keats, and the quote reads, "Poetry should be great and unobtrusive, a thing which enters into one's soul and does not startle it or amaze it with itself, but with its subject." And I was just struck by how much that to me seemed to really resemble your own photographs. It's as if that statement could just as well have been said about your pictures. And I wonder, maybe this isn't quite fair, but do you agree? But also, what you frequently quote from poets. Could you speak a little bit about the importance that poetry has to you?
Sure. Edward Weston says somewhere in his day books, I haven't read them for years, but he says something about the fact that the photographs began with, I think I'm quoting him, amazement over subject matter, not with amazement over himself or over equipment or process or over concepts. It began with amazement over what he saw right there in front of him. So that's part of what seems to me to be right about Keats' statement. poetry is strange. I went all the way through graduate study in literature, and poetry meant very little to me. My focus was on fiction. Then when I started teaching at age 25, almost simultaneously with starting teaching, I discovered photography. And slowly, over about 20 or 30 years, poetry has become the really saving grace for a lot of days. I don't know. It's hard to say why. And the funny thing is, I didn't connect the coming of photography and poetry, the linkage, until I read something in an ad from a flyer from Aperture, maybe 15 years ago or so, and it had a picture of mine, which of course got my attention. But underneath it had a quotation from Todd Pappageorge, the photographer, and it said, "At their best, photography and poetry can seem to have a near blood relationship, a proposition easier to assert than to explain." And boy, that's the truth. It's very hard to explain, but I think both poetry and photography do have their origin deeply in personal need to somehow survive in a hostile world, and I think they also resemble each other somewhat in their tendency to metaphor. They try to look squarely at specific examples and find in them a pointer beyond them.
Bob, that is, I mean, first of all, I just want to acknowledge there were more than any other photo book club we've had so many wonderful questions that we didn't get to. So I might send a couple of them to you by FedEx, and maybe if you're signed up for the Aperture PhotoBook Club newsletter, you might get, we might solicit a few more, because you are such an inspiration for how to acknowledge the frailty and failings of life, but still find something beautiful and affirming in it. And I think your pictures teach us a lot. It's been so wonderful to hear you tonight.
Thank you, Sarah.
Really.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Keep doing what you're doing, and don't stop.
I will. I can't. Maybe you'll come in as a sort of a virtual voice in a future one of these. But the Aperture PhotoBook Club continues. So we're at the end of June. We're going back to our regular Wednesday schedule, and we're going to be talking about a beautiful book by an artist named Wendy Redstar, with whom I actually think you two, philosophically, there's a lot of synergy there. So looking forward to that. Really, thank you to everyone. We're at an hour, and I promised we'd always be finished by an hour. So thank you to my colleagues at Aperture. Thank you to Candle Production. Thank you to Sarah and Bob especially, to come up in the middle of installing what I'm sure will be an absolutely gorgeous exhibition at the National Gallery of Art, which opens
May 29th or 30th, whatever the Sunday is.
Okay.
Sorry.
Open soon, and then is on view until October, right?
October 2nd.
Okay, so make a pilgrimage to Washington to see it. And of course, as always, if you have any suggestions or questions or comments for me or for my colleagues at Aperture about how to make this a better experience for you, we really want to hear it. So thank you all. Thank you, Ingram, for sponsoring us. And here we go. Another one on the books.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Bob.